Hello, my name's James. It's my first time in Adelaide. I write a free daily newsletter about podcasting. It's called Podnews.net. Nobody has yet subscribed in here. So either you're all subscribed, in which case, thank you very much, or you're just sort of sitting there going, well, if this British man impresses me, then I might subscribe later. I've been for a walk today. It's lovely outside. That's nice. I believe there's some kind of sport that's played in there as well. It's very good. So what I'm going to talk about is how people are consuming podcasts across the world, and yes, here in Australia, but in other places as well. I've got a few thoughts about where our growth is coming from, where we might be going next. I've got lots of graphs because that's what we need, and at least 2 pictures of beer if you look very carefully. Goodness, what a year it's been, hasn't it? If you just look back over just the last year, there's been so much that's actually happened. So Spotify bought Gimlet and Anchor. Those are 2 large podcasting companies. Then they bought Parcast as well. They've spent $500 million US in podcasting. We're also beginning to take analytics more seriously as well. Companies have been getting IAB certification, which is essentially the gold standard for podcast numbers. So everybody now knows what numbers they're getting and can compare them with other people as well. Luminary was a company that launched earlier on in the year. They were there to sell podcasting, be essentially the Netflix of podcasting. They had some interesting problems on their first week. They've fixed all of those issues. They aren't the only people selling podcasts to people. There's also a company called Magellan in France. There's other companies in Denmark and in Sweden as well. Apple are apparently doing some exclusive podcasts as well. There's just been an announcement today, which will be in Podnews this evening, that SiriusXM and Pandora have just bought Marvel. The Marvel podcasts, so they'll be doing lots of Wolverine podcasts and all that type of stuff as well. There's been quite a lot of acquisitions. So Triton Digital, which is a big American company, acquired Omni Studio, who are an Australian podcast host. Apple changed lots of podcast categories as well earlier on in this year. They kind of think that they run podcasting, which is lovely, but they made a bunch of changes, including at last having a true crime category for podcasting, which has actually made quite a lot of difference there. Another great thing that's come out of Australia, the Rodecaster Pro, which is a brand new, very smart, very clever multi-track recorder, especially for podcasts. Radio companies have been spending a lot of money in terms of podcasting as well. So Entercom is a very large American company. They have bought a number of large producers in the US. Also, it says that iHeart expand their podcast internationally. Rogers, which is a big Canadian podcast company, they bought a branded podcast company, and so on and so forth. So there's a bunch of all of that kind of stuff going on. So radio is really getting into podcasting too. And finally, podcasting is actually, particularly in the US, becoming much more demographically reflective of the population at large. 40% of new podcasts are hosted by women. And when you look at consumption of podcasts in the US, it pretty well now matches the demographics of the US, as a whole, in terms of both ethnic background and in terms of gender as well. So all of that, I think, shows an industry which is growing up, and an industry which is much more part of, what you would expect from a large media, a large part of the media as podcasting is. Does anybody know what this number is? It is the number of podcasts as of October the 11th. There's quite a lot of podcasts out there, it turns out. I was curious because I had a look at some numbers of the amount of books that are published every single year. And the amount of books that are published every single year is 2.4 million. And that's every single year. We've taken from 2005 up until the present day to get 751,000 podcasts. So although 751,000 sounds like a lot, actually it's quite small in comparison to the amount of books, the amount of new TV shows, the amount of other stuff which is actually out there. So it's probably not something to worry about, but we might come back to that number in a little bit. All of this is driven though because of RSS. RSS is the thing that makes podcasting work. And RSS is important because it means that literally anybody can make an RSS feed, and therefore anybody can make a podcast. So because anyone can make an RSS feed that works on any podcast app anywhere in the world, that means that nobody is in control of podcasting. And that's a very important thing to bear in mind. It's also a very important reason why podcasting has grown. Apple isn't in control, even if they think they are. Spotify isn't in control, not yet anyway. And it lets anyone, small indie podcasters, or one slightly nerdy guy in his office at home, to get on the same platform as podcasts from Nova, podcasts from iHeart, podcasts from the New York Times or the ABC, and so on and so forth. You know, the most popular podcast is Joe Rogan. And Joe Rogan is there because he's a good comedian, he's a good interviewer, he's been doing this sort of stuff for 10 years, people know who he is, but he's also there because that's his podcast. No one is in control of that. He hasn't had to go to somebody and get a ton of money to start doing that podcast. He hasn't had to go and negotiate transmitter time. He's just put that podcast out and people have started getting it. And that's a really important thing. And the same goes for Tim Ferriss or for Jordan Harbinger or for many of you. Anyone can launch a podcast. So the RSS thing here is a really important thing. But in spite of nobody being in control of it, lots of people do know about podcasting. So this is numbers from Australia in the green. For some reason, not quite sure why we get green, but still. And in comparison to the US, more Aussies know about podcasting than people in the United States, which is pretty good. Probably the ABC has a bit to do with that, probably as well the Australian, and the Teacher's Pet has a bit to do with that too. But 83% of Australians know what a podcast is, or at least have heard the word podcasts. In terms of people listening, I always like looking at weekly listening. This is weekly listening in the US, and you can see that 1 in 5 people in the US listen to a podcast every single week. 1 in 5, which is a good number. It's nowhere near as big as radio, which is 9 out of 10 people, but nevertheless 1 in 5 is a pretty good number. Here in Australia it's 1 in 6. So 15%, and again you can see that growing over the last few years. These figures, I'm showing you these figures deliberately because they are comparable, so they're worked out in exactly the same way, depending on whether you're in Australia, the US, and there are also figures for Canada and for South Africa and for Germany as well. This is the type of person who's listening to podcasts here in Australia. You can see that a little bit younger than the typical Australian, a little bit more male than the typical Australian. The growth, though, is coming from 2 places. Partially, the growth is coming from women. There's a bunch of research out there which shows that women are listening to more podcasts. But also, the growth is coming geographically as well. And on this side, look at this. Oh yeah, see, look at that. All the way over there, you can see that rural Australia is now listening to more podcasts than they ever have done. And that's good because up until now, it's been very much a cap city thing. And it's been very much focused, frankly, on Melbourne and on Sydney. And all of a sudden, we're seeing the rest of Australia catching up in terms of consumption of podcasts. And that's a great thing. Here are some details that came out only last week about women listeners to podcasts. Turns out that women listen longer to podcasts, significantly longer to podcasts, and women listen to more podcasts than men. These are American figures. And this is where the growth in podcasting is really coming from. And part of the growth in podcasting is coming from women finding great podcasts, but the other part of it is that actually there's much more great content there, as well. And that's really good news, I think. In terms of where podcasting fits, though, we've still got a long way to go. This is data that came out last Friday, and it's data from GfK, and they look at all of the audio that we put into our ears. And they reported this last Friday. It had a little bit of TV in here, which I've taken out of this particular slide because we only care about audio. But you can see that 65% of the audio that we put into our ears is live radio. That is slowly decreasing, but slowly decreasing over a very, very long period of time. Podcasting has actually gone up quite substantially over the last couple of years, but as you can see, it's still just 8%. So we've got a long way that we can actually grow, and that's quite exciting. What podcasting overtook this year is it overtook our own music. This time last year, that was more popular than podcasting. Now it isn't so, which is quite exciting, I think. Here's another exciting number, $1 billion. I always like $1 billion. That's the amount of money, apparently, that podcasting is going to make in advertising by 2021 in the US. Podcasting actually makes lots of money in lots of different ways. Advertising is one of them. Live shows and stuff like that is another way. Patreon, those types of donations is a further way as well. But seeing this graph increase is also very good for where the future of the industry is going in terms of money, at least, which is handy. And this is a good stat. It's not quite what it seems, but it's still a good stat. NPR reckon that the amount of money that they make, that's public radio in the US, of course, the amount of money that they make from podcasting is going to be more than the amount of money that they make from radio next year. And that looks pretty cool. I mean, what this doesn't say is that NPR don't actually own any radio stations, and they put their shows on other radio stations. That's basically how NPR works. But even so, there's a big story here in terms of podcasting and podcasting's growth. What have I got here? Oh yes, this looks fun. This is how we listen to podcasts. So I've given you lots of numbers of how big podcasting is, but how do we listen? And I'm going to show you how we listen in terms of individual apps. But firstly, I'm going to show you how many people have iPhones in the world and how many people have real phones in the world. So you can see here in Australia, it's actually roughly a 50-50 split. So 50% of us, when we go to Melbourne, 50% of us still have to fiddle around with Mikey cards, and 50% of us actually have them on our phones, like, as if it's 2019. But you can see that, particularly in Europe, 2/3 of the mobile phones that are out there are Android phones. North America, it's roughly an equal split. Asia, 70% of phones out there are Android phones. And actually, if you have a look at population as a whole, it's something like 76-77% use Android. And I say this for two reasons. Firstly, because the next slide you'll see looks really weird once you've seen this. But the other reason why I tell you this is please don't just link to your Apple Podcasts page. Because if you just link to your Apple Podcasts page, then everybody in green there, everybody who actually has a proper phone, won't be able to use that Apple Podcasts page at all. So there are a bunch of different services that you can use. You can either link to your Pocket Casts page, which is very lovely, or you can use services like podfollow.com, or plinkhq.com, or there's something from Chartable which does much the same thing, which will automatically link somebody to the right place for their phone. Or probably even better, just link to your website, because you've all got websites, right? So link to those. Don't just link to your Apple Podcasts page if you want to promote a podcast. Having said that, this is how people are listening to podcasts. This is according to Libsyn, which is a big podcast host. And the most popular app that people are using to listen to podcasts is Apple Podcasts. Probably no surprise. 57%, 58% of plays are through Apple Podcasts. That number's going down slowly year on year, but not anything particularly to worry about. Spotify, 12.9% it says here. Only 40% of shows on Libsyn are on Spotify, so that figure is probably a little bit higher. And then you can tell that I'm a child from the 80s. Let's have a look at the rest in here. Two things to take from this. Obviously, Apple Podcasts is the number one. Secondly, make sure that you're on Spotify as well. It's free to get on there. You just go to podcasters.spotify.com. And also, thirdly, don't forget about all of the other ways that you can listen to podcasts. Google Podcasts I'll come back to, but that number has doubled in the last year. So that's done pretty well. And most of these other ones actually get their listings from Apple Podcasts. So again, make sure that you're on Apple Podcasts, obviously, first and foremost. Spotify is a really important thing. This is where Spotify was in February. Spotify is actually the number one podcast app already in quite a lot of, well, as you can see, quite a lot of South America and Central America and bits of Europe. That was in February, because of course there are far less Apple phones in these areas. But there's been quite a lot of change, in fact, in terms of how popular Spotify is. Here we are in March, adding India, adding Indonesia, Turkey to this list. Here we are in May. April didn't apparently happen. I'm not quite sure why. Here we are in May, adding more of Europe, in June, in July, and I think there's an August in here as well. There we are, look, August. So you can see that actually Spotify appears to be increasing quite fast and quite quickly, according to the folks at Voxnest, certainly, if you compare them both. That's not to say that Spotify is the number one podcast app in these places. iVoox does pretty well in Spain, which is a Spanish language thing. The most popular country in the world for listening to podcasts, anybody? China. It's not China. The most popular country in the world. Where do people listen to podcasts more than any other country in the world? South Korea. Oh no. They don't listen to English podcasts, obviously, and they certainly don't use Apple Podcasts either. But South Korea, podcasting is massive. The reason I'm pointing out Spotify again is that Spotify is really interesting because if you look at how Australians listen to podcasts, Australians are responsible for 3.6% of all podcast downloads. When you look at the amount of downloads that Australians are responsible for on Spotify, it's actually more, it's 4.3%. So Australians over-index in the amount of podcasts that we listen to on Spotify, which is particularly interesting because if you do a search on Spotify, I'll zoom in because you can't really see that. If you do a search on Spotify, then you will find something is missing in comparison to, say, Pocket Casts. There we are. I've done a search for conversations in Pocket Casts, and at the top, conversations from the ABC, and there's no ABC radio in Spotify at all because of political reasons or something. So therefore, even though the ABC, with their 14 million downloads per month, isn't in Spotify, they're still doing really well here in Australia, which I think tells you something. So anyway, podcasters.spotify.com is where to be. And it's not just Spotify, by the way. Deezer now has podcasts in it, which is another big music service. Pandora in the US, so good over here that they shut it down. But Pandora in the US has podcasts in it as well. Anybody speak German? No? Well, I've got no idea what this says, so we'd better move. No, what this is showing is how people are consuming podcasts in Germany, and number one is YouTube. The number one platform that people think that they are consuming podcasts on is YouTube, which is interesting. If you're producing a podcast, is it on YouTube? Are people using smart speakers is another question. Well, people mostly are downloading podcasts to mobile devices. There's very little listening that happens on desktop. And when you look at smart speakers, well, smart speakers look like this, 0.21%. Basically, nobody's using smart speakers. There's a really good reason why, and I'll get to that in just a second. That said, this figure has doubled in the last year. I mean, double nothing is still nothing, but nevertheless, this is, a different piece of data from the UK, in this particular case showing how people are consuming podcasts. And again, you can see mobile phones overwhelmingly, a little bit of iPod and portable media players, hardly any smart speakers, and a few other things in between. And the reason why smart speakers don't really work is that actually we listen to podcasts alone. The figure for radio, in case you're interested, is about 50%. So 50% of people listen to radio alone, 50% with other people. But for podcasts, 90% alone. Here's another way of looking at that. This is all of the audio that Brits, in this particular case, listen to on headphones. And you can see right down here at the bottom, you can see live radio. Radio is not a thing done on headphones at all. Why would you? And right at the top, podcasts and downloads. 55% of people who use headphones listen to podcasts on them, in comparison to just 12% for radio. So again, you can see there's a big difference in the way that we consume this kind of stuff. Here's one more exciting graph showing again how we listen. Radio, yes, of course, it's much bigger than everything else, but you can see that podcasting has a nice peak at breakfast time, has a nice peak in the afternoon as we come home from school and come home from work, and actually beats most other forms of audio in the evening as we fall asleep. Please don't tell a podcaster that you fall asleep to their podcast. That doesn't go down very well. Where do people listen to podcasts? People listen to podcasts at home. This is what my house looks like. I have a new dog. My dog is busy ripping everything up that it can possibly find in my house. Thank you very much, dog. But according to the ABC, most podcast listening actually happens at home, not just out and about, as most people think. So 76% here at home. 25% listen to podcasts at work. I just like, what kind of job do you do where you can listen to podcasts at work? Fantastic, I'd like that job, please. Something else that I've spotted is that listening to podcasts on the web is actually increasing. I don't know if you've done Google searches recently where podcasts have appeared like this. I did a Google search for podcast about elephants because clearly I like elephants. And you can see that there are 3 podcasts which have appeared here, and you press the play button and you can just listen straight from a Google search, which is really cool. And I was wondering how well this worked as a way of getting more people listening to podcasts. So I got some data. This is data from Simplecast. And you can see that the amount of people who are doing this are actually increasing. Google Podcasts at the bottom, Apple Podcasts also lets you do this sort of thing at the top. So you can see that that's definitely a thing which is happening, but actually the numbers are still really, really small, as you can see. 0.05% of podcasts are being played through Google Podcasts on the web. So it's still very, very small. Having said that, I think there's a bigger story here. I think that actually Google Podcasts might not be where people listen on a normal day-to-day basis, but it might be where they discover new podcasts that they then go and have a listen to on their better podcast app, or on their phone, or however it is that they end up having a listen to. So the work that Google have done to put podcasts into search is actually really interesting and really useful for us, because I think that will help people find new podcasts. Similarly, podcasts are all over the place. You can listen to podcasts on planes these days, which is a bit weird and wonderful. On this, there's British Airways at the top left, then Air Canada, Qantas and Emirates. And there's a bunch of different podcasts on there, which is weird. This is a hotel room in the US. If you go into a Hilton, then you have access to all kinds of podcasts and music services through iHeartRadio, which is a deal that they've done with them as well. But 751,700, it's quite a lot of podcasts. It's no surprise, I think, that Australians actually find this to be quite overwhelming, because there is so much choice, and they would actually like it to be easier to find podcasts that they want to have a listen to. I look at this and I go, well, do we have a problem here? And then I go, well, I'm not sure we do, because the very next slide of this ABC research tells us that firstly, people find new podcasts by talking to other people, which is quite nice. But secondly, that 1 in 4 people last week listened to a new podcast anyway. So yes, the choice may be overwhelming, but that's not stopping people from finding new podcasts. And I think this is a really heartening figure. 2/3 of people in the past month have listened to a brand new podcast. And I think that's a quite exciting thing. Right, finally, I've got some thrillingly exciting technical details. Thrillingly exciting. I'm sure that everybody's looking forward to 3 more graphs. I was curious as to whether most people are making stereo podcasts or mono podcasts, and curious in terms of the type of bitrate that people are using. So if you are curious too, then frankly you need a life as much as I do. But anyway, 3/4 of podcasts are made in stereo, and they're mostly 128 kilobits a second, in case you were wondering. And when you have a look at mono, there's an interesting story going on in terms of mono. 1/4 of podcasts are made in mono. And when I last looked at this data 18 months or so ago, then most of the mono ones were 96 kilobits a second. Now you can see that just in the lead is 64 kilobits a second. So actually they're getting smaller. The sizes are getting smaller, and that's important because actually more of us now are streaming podcasts rather than downloading them first. So more of us are hitting that play button and just listening to a podcast as it streams into our mobile phone. And so the smaller that your file is, the better that will work. So it's interesting seeing that actually podcasts are getting a little bit smaller in terms of file size, and that's probably good news. LUFS is a terribly boring thing that I have a hobby horse about. LUFS is the loudness of your podcast. And it's the loudness of your podcast, not is everything the same loudness. That's an important thing, but that's not what LUFS is all about. LUFS is about how loud is your podcast in comparison to everything else on your phone. So your voice from Siri or your voice from the Google Assistant, your text alert, your alarm, all of the other noises that your phone makes should ideally be about the same kind of loudness as your podcast, because otherwise you will deafen people or you'll really annoy them. So -16 is the number to hit. Because -16 is what everything else on your phone is. You needn't necessarily know what -16 means, but you do need to make sure that your podcast is -16 LUFS. And the good news is that based on over 3,000 podcasts that I've sampled in the last year or so, most podcasts are around -16. But anyway, -16 is where you're at, and that's vaguely important. So, I've talked a lot and I've shown you a lot of exciting graphs, and I appreciate that you're not all falling asleep. But in conclusion, what am I saying? Well, I'm saying that podcasts are being listened to on more platforms through more apps than ever. And that's very exciting because it means that more people have access to the stuff that we are creating. We have a wonderful level playing field which is afforded to us by things like RSS. And making sure that we aren't controlled, making sure that we don't have a gatekeeper telling us what we can and can't do has never been more important. I'm concerned about some of the things that Apple are doing. I'm concerned about some of the things that Spotify are doing, and just make sure that we aren't controlled by one company. That would be really important. We are continuing to grow. As you can see, we are also continuing to grow up with all kinds of better diversity, more trustworthy analytics, better standards that we're going through as well. And finally, as you've seen from the number of podcasts out there, one of the best ways of growing podcasting is just to tell people about great podcasts. And there's a really easy way to tell people about great podcasts, and that's to use the podcasts that we have to recommend other podcasts. So I'd like to recommend one podcast today, and it's this, and I'm afraid it's a British one. Sorry about that. It's The Missing Crypto Queen, and it's a brilliant podcast from the BBC, yes, but actually it's from the BBC with two people working on it. You've got the host who is also writing it, and the producer. One of the things I like about this particular podcast is looking at somebody that looked after a fake cryptocurrency and has scammed people through billions of euros, and has all of a sudden gone missing. They haven't made all 8 in advance. They've made all 8, but they're still editing them as they release them. So it means that things that are happening in the news, or this company's reaction to the podcast, or any changes that the audience get in touch and say, oh, we've heard that this is going on, maybe you want to investigate this, all of that can be built into the podcast as they keep on going. So it's a really good trick to not just pre-record 8 different shows and release them, but to actually make sure that you can react to what your audience is saying and to what is actually happening in the news out there. So with that, I hope that that was useful and interesting, and thank you for listening. Thank you.